Hello, and welcome to this episode of the White House 1600 Sessions. I'm Stuart McLaurin, president of the White House Historical Association. We have a really terrific episode ahead, but before we begin, I want to share some exciting news. We recently learned that we have received multiple 2024 Communicator Awards of Excellence, as well as several Telly Awards for this series, the White House 1600 Sessions, that we created last year, a segment on the anniversary of John F. Kennedy's assassination, and that was the primary focus of those awards. Later on in 2024, we're going to reach a major milestone with this series, 100 episodes. And to have this recognition of these awards, as well as your continued support by watching us and following this series, really means a great deal to us. So please be sure to like us and follow us on your favorite podcast provider. Share these with your friends and your contacts, and also watch us on YouTube. Many of you listen to the audio, but it's the video that actually brings these stories to life in a very special way. So thank you very much from me and my colleagues at the White House Historical Association. And now I'm really eager to dive into today's program, which is really about an exciting and wonderful book. You know, the President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief are titles that are held and have been held by 45 very unique men over 46 presidencies since the office was established in 1789. It's the highest office in the land, the leader of the free world. But it is a role that is continually being shaped and reshaped through each decade, each presidency, each personality, and each of the character traits that create these men. Our very special guest today is author, historian, and attorney Talmadge Boston. His latest book is called How the Best Did It: Leadership Lessons from Our Top Presidents. Talmadge takes a discerning look at 8 presidents, from George Washington to Ronald Reagan, and we're going to talk today about the lessons that he learned and distilled from studying these men, and not only about them, but how these lessons can be passed along to not only boost our own leadership skills, but that we can all become better citizens. We're in the thick of this graduation season, and this is a wonderful gift for graduates, but people of any age. As I read this, I was newly inspired for my own work here at the White House Historical Association, and these traits to adapt and be reminded of these 8 men who have served our country in unique and special ways. So Talmadge, thank you so much for being with us here today, and I enjoyed the book so much. I shared with you before we started that I went in with the wrong preconceived perception that this was going to be another book paying tribute to presidents. But what you do is you focus on their strengths, their character, some of their flaws and shortcomings, but really what made these men the leaders that they were, and the lessons that you distill that are applicable to anyone in business, any student leader. How did you come to be inspired to do this book?
Well, the book is my best effort at what is called applied history. It's one thing to know and enjoy history, as so many people do. It's something else to see if you can truly apply it to daily living. And as you point out in your introduction, leaders in any fields, whether it's business, law firms, media companies, nonprofits, whoever it may be. And because I've been a student of presidential history since I was 7 years old, I've been reading presidential biographies my whole life. And I've never seen anybody who has done what I've tried to do in this book, and that is really teach people in all walks of life and of all ages how to be a better leader based upon the absolute best practices of our best presidents. And so my approach, since I'm still a full-time lawyer, was not to go to the presidential libraries and dig into the presidential handwritten letters that are so many times illegible, because all that's been done before by prior biographers of all these. So what I did was, for each of these 8 presidents, I read the leading biographies of each of them. And there's usually about 8 or 10. And with the idea of, what does John Meacham talk about in terms of leadership? Doris Kearns Goodwin, Evan Thomas, Doug Brinkley. And there was an amazing consistency and not much conflict in terms of what they were discerning that I then used as the basis for the conclusions I drew in my book. And then if anybody says, well, can we really trust the conclusions of a Dallas lawyer on the subject of presidential history? My response is that when I got finished, I mean, final draft ready to send to the publisher with each of my chapters, I had at least 2 major biographers of each of those presidents review my chapter. Did I miss something? Did I mistake something? Do you disagree with any of my conclusions? Give me your feedback. And they did, which I then incorporated into the final draft. And so I feel like the conclusions have been fully vetted by some of our leading presidential historians, and I have a lot of confidence in it. And the fact that they're endorsing it the way they have makes me feel like they have full confidence in it. And hopefully anybody who reads the book will realize that these conclusions are sound and important.
Well, this is a new book, but it's a timeless book. And I look forward to giving this as a graduation gift, as a primer to friends who are entering leadership roles. But for you, as an attorney, as someone interested in history and inspired by these leaders of our past, for me, as a young boy, I came to Washington as a 5th grader. Behind my desk hangs a picture of my 5th grade class sitting on the Capitol lawn. Vivid memories of going to the Capitol, the White House, Mount Vernon. Now, did those things send me down the path that I'm on today? I don't know, but they brought to my mind and inspired me in a way that I would not have experienced had I not come and seen these things. Do you remember your first trip to Washington, your first visit to the White House, and what impact did that have on you?
Well, I started loving presidential history on my 7th birthday. And the reason I have such clarity is we were living in Houston, and the Houston Colt 45s came to the National League and to baseball. And I was collecting baseball cards, and like all 6 years old, your brain is a sponge. You remember everything. So my head was filled with baseball statistics. And my mother became very concerned. She thought on the one thing, she had a smart little boy. On the other hand, his head was full of nothing but baseball statistics. So for my 7th birthday, she went to a bookstore and found a booklet that contained presidential trading cards. And you could, you tore them out, and there they were, same size as a baseball card. On the front was the image of the president. On the back, when was he born, when was he died, when was he president, what were the most important things he did, which I memorized instantly, and I could recite in order the presidents of the United States instantly. And so my parents recognized that I had a special interest in the field. So in the summer, after the 3rd grade, we drove in an unair-conditioned station wagon from Houston to Washington, D.C., and visited Mount Vernon and Monticello and the White House and the Capitol. And just seeing all these things up close and personal was special. And I've always had special memories of wanting to come back.
We're going to go through all of these, 8 of them. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, John Kennedy, and Ronald Reagan. Why these 8?
My choice of the 8 is largely tied. I mean, those are my personal opinion of the 8, but it was confirmed because the choice was largely tied to the C-SPAN presidential ranking poll, where every time a president leaves the White House and a new one comes in, C-SPAN does a poll of the 150 leading historians and asks them to rank the presidents from best to worst on the basis of 10 presidential leadership traits. And the last 2 times they've done the poll, in 2017 when Obama left the White House and Trump came in 2021 when Trump left the White House and Biden came in, the results were identical for the top 9. 1 Lincoln, 2 Washington, 3 FDR, 4 Theodore Roosevelt, 5 Eisenhower, 6 Truman, 7 Jefferson, 8 Kennedy, 9 Reagan. So the only tweak that I made off of the C-SPAN poll was I think Truman's overrated. I think he got us into Korea and had no idea how to get us out. It took Eisenhower to get us out. He had no idea how to deal with McCarthyism. Eisenhower came up with a plan that brought an end to Joe McCarthy. He gets a lot of credit for dropping the A-bombs and bringing a quick end to World War II. I think he had to do that. There's no way we weren't going to drop those bombs. Plan B was to invade Japan and lose hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives. So I took Truman out of my top 8. I moved Reagan up a slot. I think that in 2024, more people are interested in reading about Reagan than they are about Truman. But most importantly, I wanted there to be a good balance. And in the modern era, I have two great Democratic presidents, FDR and John F. Kennedy, and two great Republican presidents in Eisenhower and Reagan. And also in this era of heightened polarization, I want people to think about the fact, I want Republicans to think about the fact we've had great Democratic presidents. I want Democrats to think about the fact we've had great Republican presidents. We need to think in terms of breaking down these barriers that have arisen over the last few years that creates this great divide between the parties, and step back and just appreciate the greatness of our past presidents, regardless of which party they happen to be a member of.
Right. As I read this, I did not think about these 8 leaders as Republicans or Democrats. I thought about them as American presidents and also leaders for the time in which they lived. It would be interesting to know, it's not possible to know, but how effective some of these leaders would have been had they been born in a different time. Were they a leader for such a time that they were called upon to be the leader?
A question that I'm frequently asked is, well, are there any of these traits that cover the waterfront that all 8 of these presidents relied on and used to be successful? And I've come up with 3. But number 1, that speaks to your point, Stuart, is they all governed with their eyes fixed on the American middle. They weren't making decisions based on how it would work with the extreme right or the extreme left. They targeted the great American middle. That's the way you have successful government, and that's why they were successful. The other 2 traits, number 1, they were all self-aware. They all knew their strengths and their weaknesses. Where they were strong, they found ways to use their strengths. Where they were weak, they would bring in somebody who was strong in the areas where they were weak to enhance and that not be a problem. And so obviously that's an important leadership trait, to be self-aware. And then third and finally, they were all great persuaders. Now, they were great persuaders in their own unique ways. Some of them were eloquent to the masses. Lincoln, FDR, Kennedy, Reagan. Some of them were great on an up-close and personal basis. Washington, Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Eisenhower, who did their best persuasion in small groups as opposed to the multitudes, and FDR and Kennedy and Reagan, but also FDR in particular on the radio, Kennedy and Reagan in particular on television, the different mediums that were used to lead America and rethink America and cause us to head in the right direction and be open to being persuaded to go in the right direction because of their strengths as persuaders.
Yeah, I think medium is important. It would be interesting to see if Lincoln would have been as telegenic as Kennedy and Reagan, but his words and the poignancy of what he said, and in our mind's ear of us hearing Lincoln, it is profound and eloquent and strong and offsets any telegenic qualities that later presidents would have had.
I was at Gettysburg and I went through a wonderful new museum there called the Adams County Historical Society Museum. And in the video that's talking about the Gettysburg Address, it talked about in less than 3 minutes, he changed the soul of a nation. Gettysburg Address, 272 words. It took 2.5 minutes to deliver. School children are still memorizing it. It still hangs on the wall of offices everywhere and is just America's most sacred text. But I like to tell audiences when I'm explaining why Lincoln stands out as a communicator, he took the 8 magic words from Strunk and White. Eliminate unnecessary words. Say exactly what you mean. And he did that time and again. He was a relentless editor until he had removed every unnecessary word. That's why the Gettysburg Address is 272 words. It's all airtight in every respect. And
well, he probably would have been very good on Twitter or X now if he had to limit it to just such a few words.
Yeah, no doubt. But just the clarity and the choice of words, the eloquence. Of course, Lincoln growing up had not only read but memorized Shakespeare's plays, the King James Bible, Aesop's fables,
Robert Burns,
the classic poets. He had the command of that kind of language that he could work into his sentences and his speeches and his conversations. And I don't think any politician today has that kind of firepower to be able to do that on command like Lincoln did.
One thing is for sure, these 45 men who have comprised our 46 presidencies, none of them were perfect. They were all fallible human beings. And you consider 11 of our 12 initial presidents were either slaveholders or employed slaves hired from masters to work in the White House itself. In the hindsight of history, a horrible mark on American history. So we do look at things in a way, in a modern lens, and we look on the lives and the successes and the failures and the learnings of these presidencies. If they were to look, these 8 were to look upon their lives and their own presidencies, give me 2 or 3 examples of these 8 presidents that would have learned something from a failure in their life.
Well, George Washington famously, in large part, failed as a soldier during the French and Indian War, serving in the British Army. He was an aggressive and obnoxious self-promoter in wanting to get higher ranks and commissions, and in each instance, he was rejected. But the first leadership trait I identify for George Washington, he learned from his mistakes. Thereafter, nobody ever accused George Washington of being a self-promoter. So there's an example of that. George Washington also, in terms of looking back at the very end of his life, he deeply regretted the fact that he owned slaves. And so he had a new will that he signed not long before he died, that upon his death, his slaves would be free. And of course, Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner who, per the deal he had made with Sally Hemings, upon his death, she and her children were freed. So presidents do learn from their mistakes, and those are some notable examples.
Given that we're at the White House Historical Association, I have to put a question in this context. The one thing, or certainly one thing, that these 45 men had in common is that White House across the street from where we sit today. They are very different characters over spanning 200 plus years of American history, but they all lived and worked in that White House, except for George Washington. He selected the plot of land, hired the young Irish immigrant architect to build it. We are told that he stopped by in his carriage on his way from Philadelphia back to Mount Vernon after his presidency, but there's no record of him ever going in the house, which I find hard to believe. Tell us about George Washington and what you would summarize as why he is first among those listed in this book.
I present the presidents in chronological order. So because he was the first president, chapter 1 is on George Washington. But I also identify more important traits, leadership traits for him than any other president. I wrote the Washington chapter first because he got the whole thing going, and I didn't want to repeat any traits in subsequent chapters. So for example, one of Washington's most important traits was his integrity / credibility. Whatever he said, you could take it to the bank. But anytime you're the first person at the desk, the buck stops here and it's your decision, and there's all this conflict going on around you, but you have to be the ultimate decision maker. Washington really demonstrated how best to do that. I mean, in his cabinet, he had Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury. He had Jefferson as the Secretary of State. These guys didn't like each other. They didn't agree on almost everything. And here's Washington taking responsibility for this brand new nation to be the great unifier. I'm going to make every decision based upon doing what it takes to keep this country unified as best I can. Because if we don't stay unified, this isn't going to last long. And so his every decision and his way of going about making decisions. When Hamilton and Jefferson would disagree on an important policy, he would say, okay, you need to go back to your office. You need to go back to your office. You need to write a written position paper explaining your position on this issue, and then bring them to me, and Washington would study them and reflect on them and decide which ultimately made the most sense to him, being the best interest of the country, and make that decision. But it's always comforting even if he goes another way, to know that he considered your position and was respectful toward your position. He set the precedent with his farewell address of being able to say, okay, I'm about to depart, go back to Mount Vernon. But I do want to have some closing thoughts to be relied upon, or at least considered by my successors, because nobody knows what it's like until you sit at that desk. I've sat at this desk for 8 years, and here's where I come out. And that's obviously very important information to share.
You write about Thomas Jefferson maximizing harmony and reducing tension, presidential pixie dust that we wish we could sprinkle into the 21st century. Tell us about Jefferson.
Well, Jefferson was not a great public speaker. In fact, one of the most interesting things that I came across in the research was that in his 8-year presidency, he gave a grand total of 2 speeches. His 2 inaugural addresses were the only speeches he gave. Being self-aware, knowing he was not strong as a public speaker, but knowing he was strong in this up-close and personal relationship, and knowing that the country needed somebody in the aftermath of John Adams' presidency, where we'd had the Sedition Act, and people had been thrown in jail for expressing opinions against President Adams or Federalist policy. Like George Washington's commitment to being a unifier, Jefferson's commitment was, we got to break these walls down. We can't be throwing each other in jail because we disagree. We got to find ways to build our relationships so that we can get along and make government work. And so there's 2 great adages that you hear often in the 21st century. Number one is, politics is all about relationships. If you have great relationships, you're going to know how to make things work in politics. But secondly, that if somebody likes you, they're going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And if they don't, they won't. And so Jefferson got that. And so over the course of his 8-year presidency, 2 to 3 times a week, he would host these dinners where there'd be Republicans and then there'd be Federalists. And the one rule for these dinners, we're not going to talk about hot button issues. We're going to talk about history, literature, music, what you do for a living, what's your family. We're going to talk about the things that people talk about when you're trying to be friends. And they did. It was like a conversation among friends. And so the barriers started coming down with each passing year, and you don't accomplish this in one dinner or 3 or 5. He was a relentless relationship builder, and thereby developed this massive group of people who are willing to give him the benefit of the doubt of everything. So he gets through with 8 years, and his best friend Madison gets 8 years, and then his successor, Monroe, along the same lines, 8 years. There's a 4-year window for John Quincy Adams, and then here's Andrew Jackson, another 8 years. So in 32 out of the first 36 years of the 19th century, we basically have Thomas Jefferson as president because of the way he went about bringing people together and thereby getting the public mood to respond favorably to anybody who was looking at how to manage government the way he did.
Abraham Lincoln, you speak of having all 24 of the traits that you identify. Speak to that.
Well, early in the chapter, I give that wonderful quote from Tolstoy, who said, you look at the greatest leaders in the history of the world, Alexander the Great, anybody else, none of them compare to Lincoln. So Tolstoy was a pretty shrewd, brilliant guy, and for him to draw that conclusion. But when we think of, and I make the argument in the chapter that you could say Lincoln was a genius in 4 areas. Number one, he was a legal genius. You study his legal career, which is very well documented in the Lincoln Papers in Springfield, the way he handled cases, the way he got results, the way he knew when to settle when his case wasn't any good, the way he knew how to persuade juries and judges and Supreme Courts. Just a fabulous record as a lawyer. He was a political genius. Here's a guy who had 1 2-year term in the U.S. House, and then he becomes president of the United States. How do you do that? How do you figure out how to get the Republican nomination in 1860 when there's all these high-powered people who've been in D.C. forever and are much better known? Political genius. Third, he became a military genius. Civil War begins, and he thinks that these West Point graduate generals like McClellan know what they're doing, and they're going to know how to devise a strategy that will win the war. Turned out they didn't. Turned out they knew all about the X's and O's of military strategy, but they didn't have what it took to actually engage in battle. And that drove him crazy. So he goes to the Library of Congress, he reads up on military history, military strategy, devises the plan that wins the Civil War. And then lastly, and this is the part that's most fascinating to me, is you could say he was a theological genius. And John Meacham in his most recent book talks about that. Ronald White in his books talks about that his faith journey, that particularly during his presidency, but that ultimately culminated in the second inaugural address, where he's saying, how can a just and loving God allow this chosen, wonderful country to have this civil war where we lost 750,000 people, millions have been injured, so many amputees? Why is this happening to us? And he draws the conclusion that's the focal point of his second inaugural address. It's our punishment for having allowed slavery. So that's why he stands head and shoulders. There's never been anybody else who I think you could argue was a genius in those four major areas.
So with the foundation of Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, let's look at the other five and speak to their top quality and the challenge that perhaps launched them into putting them on this list. Teddy Roosevelt, a bit unorthodox, the advent of a new American century. Speak to him.
Theodore Roosevelt's given credit for expanding the presidency. Never before had an American president gotten involved in a labor dispute. He solves the coal strike. Never before had anybody used the Sherman Act to try to bring down these trusts that were dominating the economy and were bad for Americans across the board. Never before had anybody tried to pull off an international transaction like the Panama Canal. Never before had an American president looked at the beauty of America and said, we got to preserve this. We got to expand our national parks, our national wildlife refuges. So he saw where America needed to get better. He saw that those issues were not going to be addressed by Congress, and that the only way they would ever get addressed meaningfully would be by a president. And so he expanded the president in important and positive ways. So the leadership trait, don't be stuck on what your predecessors have done or on conventional wisdom about what your position allows you to do. Look outside the box and think of ways that you can make things a whole lot better by breaking new ground.
Another Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, our only four-term president, critical time in American history, his leadership.
Well, Ronald Reagan is frequently called the great communicator, but nobody was a better communicator than Franklin Roosevelt. And in the Reagan chapter, I open it by talking about 12 comparisons. Franklin Roosevelt was Reagan's hero. Ronald Reagan voted for Franklin Roosevelt all four times. It wasn't until later that he became a Republican when he said, the Democratic Party left me. I didn't leave the Democratic Party. But there's so much that justifies Franklin Roosevelt's being ranked number 3 in the C-SPAN poll, dealing with the country during the Great Depression and then during World War II. But it all boiled down to being this incredibly successful communicator. And he was the master really in two areas, both his oratory to the masses, his first inaugural address, we have nothing to fear but fear itself, and rethink our whole attitude toward the Depression. His remarks right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor about what's happened and how we need to respond to this situation. But also, obviously, his calm voice on the radio. There were lots of Americans who were panicking over the Great Depression and then later over World War II. And he kept the lid on that. People trusted him that if he could speak in a way like, I've got this under control, it gave the people confidence. And that's why in his 4 elections, he always had over 80% of the electoral vote.
Dwight Eisenhower, a military leader on the global stage before he was a political leader on the national American stage. Speak to his leadership in the former that informed and inspired and led to his leadership in the latter.
Well, Eisenhower was an incredible organizer of large groups, and he demonstrated that during the war, Supreme Allied Commander, bringing those different countries' armies together, functioning as one unit, everybody on the same page, achieving the desired result. And so he was a master. Part of that, delegating responsibility to people who, in fact, can do their jobs. And he doesn't need to micromanage because he's appointed the right people. Similarly, when he becomes president of the United States, he had not been impressed by the way either FDR or Truman ran their White Houses from an organizational standpoint. So he changed everything. His cabinet meetings every Friday, and he's in them, and he's leading the discussion. Same with his National Security Council. Same with his Office for Congressional Liaison. He put into place this well-oiled machine organization, which caused there to be healthy dialogue among competing perspectives, again, with the president as the ultimate decision maker. And by all accounts, everybody who was, whether they were in his cabinet or his National Security Council, Office of Congressional Liaison, whatever it was, it didn't take long for people to realize the president's the smartest guy in the room. I mean, it's just like Lincoln and the team of rivals. No, he's the smartest guy in the room. And anybody who's ever been part of an organization where the leader was not the smartest guy in the room, that's not what you want. But when you've got somebody who you know is listening, processing, who's mindful of all the pertinent circumstances that bear on this decision, and then makes that decision and can explain it in a way that you accept and understand and agree with, that's when an organization is functioning at its highest level.
You speak to presidents having their favorites of former presidents and being inspired by certain ones. Eisenhower looked, among others, I'm sure, but Eisenhower looked to Lincoln. Speak to that relationship.
Well, they were both the smartest guys in their room, but Eisenhower realized that Lincoln had achieved this amazing objective of bringing an end to the war and being a superb military strategist, which obviously Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was a military strategist. He respected him on the military front. He respected him on the political front. I'm sure he could respect his eloquence, which Eisenhower wished that he'd had, but he didn't. But it didn't bother him because nobody's in the same league as Abe Lincoln.
Last summer was the 60th anniversary of John Kennedy's return to Ireland, first American president to go to Ireland. Of course, all 8 of his great-grandparents had been Irish, and so he had a real passion for that. So in preparation for that trip that I took, I listened to Kennedy's speeches on that trip 60 years prior. And what I took from that, just listening to his energy, his passion, his vision, his speeches were ideas, not programmatic or bureaucratic. And I was reminded of that about him and inspired by that. He was an orator and a communicator and articulate in the way that he presented with energy. Speak to that component and that vitality of his leadership. Also, a presidency cut short, the what ifs of had he been president for 4 years or had he been president for 8?
Well, the trait about Kennedy that stands out for me was how, on the one hand, as you say, he would orate with incredibly eloquent words. The difference between him and others is that his words actually inspired deeds, greater things happening for the country. His inaugural address, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And soon thereafter, he starts up the Peace Corps, and soon tens of thousands of young Americans say yes and go abroad and enhance American public relations, and the Peace Corps is still doing great things. So that idea that sparked that, a year later, 1962, we're trying to come to grips with what we want to do about the space race, and he comes up with his American moonshot and gives that speech at Rice Stadium in Houston where he says, we're going to go to the moon in this decade, not because it's easy, but because it's hard, and it's going to show how smart and how strong we are, and we're going to do it. And that inspires Congress to increase the budget substantially, and of course we have a man on the moon within the decade. And then a year later, the issue of civil rights. His first 2 years, he'd done nothing on civil rights. He was trying to make sure he'd get reelected in 1964, and to be an aggressive civil rights proponent would alienate the southern United States, which largely had not been enlightened toward the need for civil rights. But then all of a sudden, Birmingham happens. And he sees on national television fire hoses blown hard against black children, and dozens of vicious attack dogs turned loose on black adults. And he's sickened. And then a few weeks later, he sees George Wallace standing in the front door of the University of Alabama, preventing black students from being able to interview that university. And he's sickened. And he goes on TV that night and gives a speech that's largely spontaneous, but says As far as I'm concerned, this is no longer a political issue. This is a moral issue. And shortly thereafter, he submits the Strong Civil Rights Bill, which he pushes, but he can't get through before he's assassinated. And then, of course, Lyndon Johnson picks up the ball, and we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ended Jim Crow. And so it's the power of words turning into deeds. And you say, well, what was his magic dust that made it work so well? And the answer, one of his biographers, Stephen Knott, a brand new biography of Kennedy, came out in the last 2 years, said he was whether it's in Ireland or anywhere else, he was appealing to the better angels of our natures in every audience, never to the dark side. And that's why his words had such power, both when they rang in your ears, but also the next day when good things started happening because of those words.
Ronald Reagan, labeled the great communicator, a presidency, the legacy of which could perhaps be described as inspiring freedom, changing the world. But you focus on optimism.
And that was one of the most uplifting parts of my research, to get a handle on Reagan's optimism. There was nothing about his childhood and adolescence that would cause anybody to be optimistic. His father was a horrible alcoholic. They were always moving from place to place to place, living out of a suitcase, never had any money. He had a saint of a mother who inspired him and inspired his optimism and always made him feel like he wanted to be the best that he could be. And in fact, he was. But of course, Reagan became the president immediately after Jimmy Carter's presidency, where we'd had double-digit inflation, high unemployment, low economic growth, long gas lines, and we couldn't get the hostages out of Iran. America was in a state of national malaise. Somebody had to remind us of the greatness of the country, American exceptionalism. And Reagan did that. A fun fact from the research that Reagan hated pessimists as much as he hated communists. I mean, he didn't want to be surrounded by any pessimists. It's uplifting to read about Ronald Reagan and how he went about leadership. Obviously flaws. He was not a detail guy, hence the disaster of the Iran-Contra situation where things were going on that he didn't have his finger on. And as president of the United States, you got to have your finger on that stuff. So he had that flaw. But in terms of inspiring the country to look at the world differently, look at the United States differently with a positive attitude, that's why I have him in my top 8.
President Reagan kept on the resolute desk in the Oval Office 2 small signs. One said, "It can be done."
All caps, C-A-N.
All caps.
It can be done.
The other one, paraphrasing, "It's amazing how much you can accomplish if you don't mind who gets the credit." Simplified words and language, but how much of those two sayings defined his leadership?
I think one of the great things about President Reagan is obviously at the outset of his presidency, there were so many people who were fearful. You know, this guy's been an actor most of his career. He's been governor of California. He talks very strongly about the need for increasing our defense and America's position in the world. Is he gonna bring us into World War III or nuclear holocaust? And there's all this fear. And yet, what an incredibly effective diplomat he was. He didn't want war, but he knew if you're going to negotiate, you need to negotiate from a position of strength. Look at the relationship he built with Gorbachev, and look at the fruit that arose because of that relationship. And it took a lot of work, and it took a lot of face-to-face encounters. But just as Jefferson learned at his dinners, Reagan learned at his summits, that as long as we're emotionally intelligent and respectful and thinking our highest thoughts and appealing to the better angels of our nature, good things are going to happen. And they did.
There's no PhD program you can take at a great American university to equip and prepare and make you a leader like one of these 8. What was the secret sauce? Was it the upbringing, the communities, the families around them, the leadership experiences, the failures that they each experienced? What are the traits that you see in these 8 that are common to all of them that made them who they were?
Well, we are all the product of our life circumstances. Who our parents were, who our family was, who our neighbors were, who our enemies were, who our teachers were. So those are common circumstances. In my mind, what separates presidents of the United States is they have a level of ambition about wanting to do great things for the country and are so mindful of their legacies. They not only aspire to be remembered in history, they want to be remembered favorably in history. You think about Abe Lincoln as a young man, age 23, says, my ambition is I want to be esteemed by my fellow men. Well, in other words, I want to be famous. And to be famous in a good way, you got to do something really great. And when he's signing the Emancipation Proclamation, he says, I finally did it. This is something that's going to be remembered. And of course, it is. So many people think that ambition is not necessarily a positive word. When it becomes all-consuming and you lose your moral compass, then obviously it's a bad thing. But these presidents didn't lose their moral compass, but they aspired to be as great as they could be and to be the greatest president they could be, to create the greatest results for the country that they could achieve. And so that's what separates them.
In this wonderful book, you focus on 8 men who were 8 of 45 men who have been president of the United States. These 8 men had a life partner. We call them the First Lady. We haven't talked about any of those partners or the First Ladies. Speak to a couple of those First Ladies to these 8 men and the role, the influence, the significance that perhaps they had that helped make them the men that they became, the president that they became.
Well, in particular, Martha Washington was incredibly loving and supportive of her husband. I mean, keep in mind, during the 8 years of the American Revolution, he went to Mount Vernon only once or twice for a couple of days. So he's out of the house running the military. Martha Washington would go to Valley Forge and places where he was just to let him feel a little love. And she was steadfast in that in every respect. So that's an incredibly important component of a presidential spouse, that there's going to be lots of bad days. And you got to have somebody who on the bad days is still going to make you feel loved and supported. Theodore Roosevelt's wife was incredibly supportive. He was in many ways an outrageous character, doing all kinds of crazy things and saying things and living life at triple speed and would otherwise have driven somebody crazy. She was steadfast and kind of went with the flow, and a lot to be said for that. Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, she and Franklin had had separate lives ever since she discovered the love letters with Lucy Mercer. But during his presidency, when he's got polio, and yeah, he takes car trips and train trips from time to time, but he's wanting to keep his finger on the pulse of the American people. So Eleanor's on the road, all over the country, listening, discerning, and coming back and saying, here's where the people are in Arizona or Michigan or Rhode Island. Incredible source of information, incredibly important to FDR. And then Nancy Reagan, who was involved in everything. So the only way you could get anything to move with Ronald Reagan was to kind of go through Nancy. They were soulmates in every respect, and she was involved in every decision, and for the most part, his decisions were good.
Last question. If you could pick 2 of these 8 and eavesdrop on those 2 having dinner tonight, which 2 would you pick, and what do you think they would talk about?
I think it might be Reagan and FDR. And the reason is because they had so many similarities, because Reagan had adored FDR as a leader and as a president, as a spokesman, as a communicator, and then Reagan follows in his footsteps for a different party, for a different cause, but in so many ways aligned, and yet they never met. And so to see how that conversation would go, recognizing that both of them are optimists, incredibly, it'd be positive, sparks would fly, hearts would be warmed. It would be an incredibly fun conversation to be a fly on the wall and see how these 2 great leaders interacted in the event that they were to get together and have a conversation.
One thing that's interesting to me about the American presidency is our current recent presidents had the benefit of the knowledge and the awareness of the experiences of all those who preceded them. Our earliest presidents that we've spoken of, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln, had no idea what would follow them, who would be the presidents in the future. And they might be inspired, they might be mortified, but it's an interesting perspective to me that you know what you follow, but you don't know the course that you're setting for the future. And so you're doing your best, stepping out on faith, using the resources that God has given you and the awareness in your own mind, which you hope is brilliance. But it's an interesting thing, this American presidency. We, as the White House Historical Association, have the privilege of having a consistent and constant role. Our role is the same regardless of who the president may be. Since we were founded in 1961 by Mrs. Kennedy, we've had the privilege of working with 12 presidencies. A real privilege of mine is having conversations like this and learning about our presidents, about the house in which they lived. I often say that the thing I love most about my job is we're an education organization and we teach and tell these stories, but not a day goes by that I don't learn something myself. So thank you for what you've shared with me today. I've learned some things in this conversation, and this is a wonderful book. And thank you for your interest in history, your care about the context in which our presidents came to be, and the leadership legacy that they have for us today, and the lessons that we all can apply to our own lives from these 8. Thank you, Talmadge.
Well, what I'd like to say, Stuart, is thank you for the White House Historical Association for the great things that you do that keep people like me jazzed in every aspect of your mission, the products that you create that help people remember history more favorably, that enhance the legacy of our presidencies. Thank goodness we have a White House Historical Association.
Right. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening and watching today. Be sure to subscribe to the White House 1600 Sessions on your favorite podcast provider so that you never miss an episode. And please watch the video version on YouTube and Facebook. Your support of the White House Historical Association makes this work possible. When you become an association member, or when you purchase a book or an official White House Christmas ornament, you are helping fund the education mission through our teacher programming, our publishing, and our latest initiative, one that I'm extremely excited about, the People's House, a White House experience. In September 2024, we will launch this new immersive experience at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue. The People's House will be open to everyone. You can learn more about our work as a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization by going to our website, whitehousehistory.org. Thank you very much.